We are on Revelation Part 4, Lesson 4 today. And this is the second lesson on what particular subject are we looking at?
The Antichrist.
The beast, the Antichrist, right. Last week we established through John's writing in 1st and 2nd John that the Antichrist he mentions there is indeed the beast of Revelation. It's just more information, a different title. He's the only one that uses that title that most of us are all familiar with, the word or the title Antichrist, right? So being reminded of what we saw in 1st and 2nd John last week, I just told you that John said Antichrist, but he also talked about there are two things about Antichrist. What do you remember learning in 1st and 2nd John last week? There's a spirit of Antichrist, right? Mm-hmm. In that time when John was writing, but is there a spirit now of Antichrist? Yeah. Okay, and what kind of defines that spirit of Antichrist? What's the attitude? What's the thought process? What is the spirit of Antichrist?
They don't believe in Jesus.
They don't believe specifically that Jesus is what? Really, that he's the Christ, which means that he's the anointed one or Messiah, right? And that means that so there's the two things about Jesus, which is what two parts of nature that make Jesus who he came and was.
He
Both
came
his
to earth from heaven and he arose.
Right.
Is that what you mean?
That Jesus came in the flesh. That was one of the things that he mentioned. So that's Jesus's humanity. So what's the other aspect of Jesus that they're denying? His humanity and his deity. Thank you. Humanity and deity, because both are true. He wasn't one or the other, or one during part of the time and another during. Some believe that he was God at a point, or God before and God after, but not God during. But he was God. He is God, was God, will be God, right? Always, exactly, eternally. He was God. So Jesus' deity and his humanity, John specifically said that they're denying that Jesus came in the flesh, that's his humanity, from God, and they're denying his deity, that he is Messiah, and that he is God. Okay, so that's the spirit of Antichrist. In other words, that's the ideology, that's the thought process that was there when John was writing, and as Ann was saying, is true of today as well. But it's that's the spirit of it. But John also says there have been Antichrists, there are Antichrists, there's the spirit of Antichrist, but he also says there is going to be the Antichrist. There is coming one that is specifically the Antichrist. All right, so we saw that last week in 1st and 2nd John. We looked extensively at the beast of Revelation, and in Revelation 13 in specific, which talks about the beast in great detail. Other times it talks about other things. We saw that there are certain things about the beast of Revelation 13 that he does. Where does he get his power? From the dragon, from Satan himself. Right? He gets his power, he gets his throne, he gets his authority. How long does he have authority? 3.5 years. It says 42 months, which is 3.5 years. Right. He specifically wars against who? Whom? The saints, exactly. God's saints. He wars against those. But he has authority over, what is the spectrum? What is the breadth of his authority? The whole world, right? Every nation, every tongue, every language. Okay? So, and we also know in return, those that dwell on the earth do what towards him? They worship him and worship Satan also as a result. Okay? The one that is empowering him. So those are some basic things that we learned last week. We know that the beast is also the Antichrist of John 1 and 2. And this week, we looked a lot in the book of Daniel. We looked also in Matthew and in Mark. We looked in 1 Thessalonians as well, right? So as we go through, and then we looked in Revelation also. So as we go through our lesson today, we're just going to go in Bible order, as we'll call it. You can get out your charts and your list of things. You can look. We're going to start in Daniel chapter 7. We're going to look at Daniel 7, Daniel 9, then Daniel 11 and 12 also. But I want to remind you as you're flipping and as you're turning, when we did our study of Daniel, if you weren't here, I'll remind, or you can go back and look. But in Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar was given a vision of a statue, right? That statue had a head of gold, the two arms and chest area of silver. It had a girded around its belly or whatever of bronze, and then its legs were iron, and the toes, or the feet and toes, were iron and clay mix. Okay? Then if you go on into, I can't remember which chapter in Daniel, I'm going to say 5 or something like that. There's another vision when Daniel, or maybe, anyway, Daniel's given the vision in 7, but we're also told about we're told what those parts of the statue are in 2. Let's just stay there for a second. The parts of the statue represent individual kingdoms, right? How many kingdoms were there in total? 4 earthly kingdoms, right? 4 human earthly kingdoms. And I specifically say that because we forgot to mention there is a rock or stone that's taken out of the mountain, not by human hands. And what does that stone do to the statue? Yeah, it hits them at the feet, and then the whole statue is crumbled or crashes because of that stone. And that stone is a kingdom also. So that is a 5th kingdom, but it is not a kingdom of this world in a sense. It's on this earth, but it's not the same as the other 4. The other 4, the first one is the one that Daniel is in when he's writing, and what is that one? Babylon, right. The head is Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, the gold. The Medo-Persian is the next one. And then later we're told it's the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire. I'm looking at my body parts for the different portions. And then the legs is another kingdom, but it's never mentioned by name in Daniel. But from history, from time, and from Western civilization, if you took the course, what's the next kingdom? Rome, right. No other, there's only 4. So it was the Babylonian kingdom of Daniel's day, then the Medo-Persian, then the Greeks, and then the Roman Empire. So when he talks about the 10 toes of the statue, he's talking about that 4th kingdom. Even though we know there's the fall of the Roman Empire, because we also have that history. So that's part of why we believe when we look at these other things that are talking about and referencing back, I wanted to remind you, there were only 4 kingdoms, other than the 5th kingdom, which is Jesus' kingdom that he's going to set up. There's only 4 kingdoms. We got to keep that in mind. There's not another and another and another. So if there's only 4 kingdoms, when the times of the 10 kings come, where do they come? What kingdom they come out of? The Roman Empire. That may be a revived, as we call it, Roman Empire. So that's important to keep in mind. So as you looked this week at Daniel 7, the vision that he's given here, who is given this vision? Do you remember? Daniel is given this vision. In the book of Daniel, the first 6 chapters deal mostly in theme with visions of other people that Daniel interprets. Like I just mentioned, the Daniel 2 statue was Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And then later Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of a tree and all of that that's cut down and all. Daniel interprets those. Where does Daniel get his interpretation? From God, and he always credits God. Daniel's not just a soothsayer. He gets his interpretation from God. Sometimes he had to be given the vision too, because Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't tell him what it was. But in chapters 7 through 12, the division happens. 7 through 12, who is the one that gets the visions in 7 through 12 of Daniel? Daniel does. He gets a vision, and who interprets the visions? Not a person. An angel will come. So obviously, again, from God, Daniel's will get a vision, and then an angel is sent to tell him what that vision means. all right, so that we know. So when you look through the book of Daniel, you have to look at the first 6 chapters as chronological in themselves. And then 7 through 12 are chronological in themselves, but 7 through 12 have to fit in somewhere with 1 through 6. So that's part of how the book is divided. So as we look at Daniel 7, and we're looking at this vision of Daniel's, he's given a vision of what in general? What are the parts of his vision? Beasts, right. How many? 4. Interesting. Okay, so there's 4 beasts, and each of these beasts, we're told by the interpretation, are what? Kingdoms. There's 4 kingdoms. Then we focused in on the 4th one because Daniel also focused in on the first one. So the first beast was like a lion. The second beast was like a bear. Okay, and up on one side. The third beast was like a leopard, and the 4th beast was like a terrible, strong, dreadful. Didn't even give a description of the 4th one. Yeah, and had iron teeth. Okay, as we did our study of Daniel, and if you do, and Kay also says, Daniel is the blueprint of prophecy. If you look at it, the world's history fits in the book of Daniel. Even though, time has had to happen for us to understand some of it from Daniel's day. But that dreadful and terrifying beast, he's described more, but I call him the DT beast. The dreadful and I think Kay calls him that. The dreadful and terrifying beast, the DT beast. Not even given an animal type of representation. If you go back and you look at the lion was tied into Babylon as far as even their images, they had images of lions. Then you've got the bear with 2 sides, that's one side being stronger than the other, that's the Medo-Persian. And then you've got the leopard, which was Greece, and you think about how swiftly Alexander the Great took over. I mean, he just really quickly, everywhere he went fast, and that's represented by the leopard. And it's also interesting when you get to Revelation 13, and you have the beast of Revelation 13 described. He's described with these animal characteristics: lion, bear, and leopard. So you maybe see that within that final kingdom that's going to maybe be a revived Roman Empire, you see the remnants of all the ones prior, because that's what a lot of those did, was just go in and absorb what was there. Just like take it over, but take it in as well. So the Romans took over the Greek Empire and expanded it, but they also took on a lot of the Greek culture within there. So there's that absorption, right? And then we know from the statue vision, the 10 toes are iron and clay mixed, because the iron mixed with peoples mixed with peoples. So we have less strong, because iron doesn't mix with clay and stay together. It doesn't improve it or make it stronger. It doesn't adhere very well. So it's not the same kind of kingdom. Okay, not as strong on its own as the iron was. So in Daniel chapter 7, as we look at this DT beast, this 4th beast, which represents a 4th kingdom, we're told that, right? There is a description of this beast. If you look at verse 7, what does it say this beast has?
Large iron teeth.
Iron teeth, which reminds us of the iron legs, and what else?
10 horns.
10 horns. Okay, so in the Daniel 7 description, we have 10 horns. What are we told after this about those horns? I'm sorry? Okay, so it says, as I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little horn, comes up, right? Okay, so is it one of the 10? No, it is separate from, but it comes up among them, right? Okay, so it says another horn, and then it says it does what to a number of those?
Pulls out 3 of them.
Yeah, it does something. It does something to 3 of them. It pulls them up. Later it says it subdues. It subdues 3 of them, right? Okay. And then it says, it gives a description of that little horn in verse 8 at the end. What does it say about the horn?
Eyes
Eyes like eyes of a man and,
Very great boast.
okay, so it has, we'll just say human eyes. And it utters boasts. It's a mouth that utters boasts. Does that remind you, that description of uttering boasts, remind you of anything?
beast.
The beast of Revelation 13, right? Because he has arrogant words, is what it says there, and blasphemous. It says blasphemous things. Okay, so then if you, the verses 9 through 14 start talking about the Ancient of Days and the one like the Son of Man coming, and how they interact, and the reason part of their being told is in verse 12, it says, as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for a appointed period of time. But, okay, sorry, going back to 11, it says, I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. So we see this fourth beast is slain, destroyed, and it has to do with the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. One like the Son of Man. And then it says in verse 15 that Daniel was distressed and he asked what the meaning was, and he wanted to know the meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, teeth of iron, claws of bronze, devoured, crushed, and trampled down with the remainder of its feet, and the meaning of the 10 horns on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 of them fell. And then, so he's kind of repeating what the description was. And what is he told about that? In verse 24. What are these 10 horns? Okay. So 10 horns are 10 kings. What else is he told?
It will arise after them
Okay.
and will subdue 3 kings.
So there's another one. Right. Okay, so there's another after them who will arise. So there's the 10 kings who will arise, and then there's another. So again, this another or other horn or little horn is a king, and he will arise. And then he's not the 10, he's separate from the 10. And it says, there's a time phrase in verse 25. It says, he will wear down the saints of the highest one. And again, what does that remind you of? Where have we heard about the saints of saints? Yes, the beast, exactly. He is going to make war with the saints, what we're told in Revelation 13. But here it says he's going to do something else.
Make alterations in times and the law.
Okay, so he's going to make alterations in, does it say time or times?
Times.
And law. And does it say he will make or he will attempt to make?
He intends to
He
make.
intends to make. Okay, so I just put make, but he intends to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for how long? Okay, time, times, and half a time, which we know is the same thing as what? 3.5 years. In Revelation 13, we're told the beast has authority for 42 months, which is 3.5 years. So there's that correlation possibly, but making alterations in times and law is a little different, right? Whenever you hear of law, what do you normally think about? Obeying the law, laws of our land even, America, right? How laws are made, who enforces the law, all of that, right? But remember, the book of Daniel is written to what group of people?
Jews.
The Jews, Daniel's people, God's chosen people, right? So whenever, if I said the Jews, or if I said God's chosen people and I use the term the law, what am I usually talking about? Ten Commandments plus. The Mosaic Law, right? That is written down in the first 5 books of the Bible, right? What, in their law, what kind of things go on? What parts are there to the law? Temple worship, and that includes sacrifices and grain offerings and things like that, right? But it also, as far as times are concerned, what else do they have in their religious calendar?
Their feast.
They have feasts and festivals, right? Okay, so you can imagine all of that he's maybe going to try to alter their feasts and festivals when they do their sacrifices, because their sacrificial system is also tied to those feasts and festivals, why they do what they do. There's also daily sacrificing and all. Okay, so if he's going to try to make alterations in times and law, that's the type of thing maybe that it's talking about. Okay, that he's going to try to change, let's just say, the Judeo system of worship. Okay, but what does that also indicate that's going on? Right, their Judeo system, the sacrifices and the worship, the way the law has laid it out for them. Is that going on now? Not fully. They might practice the feasts as much as they can, but they don't practice them with the sacrificial system because what isn't present now? There is no temple right now. Okay, so when this is going to happen, when Daniel's writing about this, let's just say that, when Daniel is writing about this in the time, he's in Babylon at the time. What doesn't exist? The temple had been already destroyed, right? Not just when Daniel was taken, but in the 3rd siege. Daniel was taken in the 1st, and by the time he's writing this, the temple has been destroyed. There is no temple. So he's not talking about a current temple system that's being destroyed, because they're not there. They're not practicing at the temple. Can they do their sacrificial system anywhere? No. They can mark on their calendar and represent the Passover and Day of Atonement, things like that. They can mark those times and mark them in practicing some, but they can't practice their sacrificial system apart from having a temple. Okay, now think in history and time, what happened after Daniel's time till before our time? Was there a temple again? Yes, there was another temple. It was built after the return, after the 70 years of captivity. There was another temple built, and then it was enhanced by Herod. So a lot of times we refer to it as Herod's temple. Was that temple in existence when Jesus walked the earth? Yes. He was taken there for dedication, right? He stayed there when he was 12-ish, when he was brought with his parents, and he stayed behind, remember? And he talked to the people. He was instructing, essentially, teaching in the temple. And then when Jesus was crucified, the temple was still in existence. But what do we know happened in history? 70 AD, that temple was destroyed. So from 70 AD to we're in 2016, is there a temple? No. No temple, no temple worship. All right? So if this is happening if this is the beast of the future to us, future to Daniel, future to us, what do we know has to be in existence?
Temple.
There's got to be a temple, right? And there will be. So we see he's going to try to make the alterations, and they're given into his hands. Now, when it says they will be given into his hands, it's a pronoun. What is it referring back to? What's its antecedent? Did you think about it? Did it? You think it's the saints? Okay, because the saints are talked about prior to this. Is there anything else? Because that's the first thing that comes to my mind, is the saints, will be given into his hand for times, and half a time. But also, we just talked about the times and law. Is it saying they will be given into his hands? Or maybe all of it, saints, times, and law, will be given into his hands. I'm not exactly sure, but it's something we need to stop and think about sometimes. What is going to be given into his hands? We know from the beast of Revelation 13, he will make war with the saints, and he's going to have authority over the entire world. Okay? So it could be any and all of that, right? Then it says, I love the first word of verse 16. What is that? But the court will sit for judgment. And what else does it say? Okay, so dominion is taken away. It says he'll be annihilated and destroyed
Forever.
forever. Okay. And again, from our study of Revelation all along, but certainly even last week as we were looking at the beast, we see this is his end, right? The beast's end. He will be destroyed. He will have a time, but it will come to an end. Now, on our timeline that we had done so many times, we know that the time of his 3.5 years begins at what point in time in Revelation? What pivotal point?
Abomination.
Well, that's not from Revelation, but that's good. But from Revelation timeline,
For the two witnesses.
when he comes out of the abyss, then he kills the two witnesses, that's their 3.5 years. But then the next 3.5 years is when he is empowered by the dragon. He has the last 3.5 years. And his end comes with what event? Christ's return to earth and the battle that happens, we call it the Battle of Armageddon. And he's cast where? Into the lake of fire. And who's cast with him? Second beast, also called the false prophet. Very good, very good. So you're coming from memory. We don't have it over here. That's really good. Okay, so that's the tie-in here. His times and half a time, his 42 months of Revelation, as it calls it, is in that second half of the last covenant week that, or that covenant week that we're going to talk about from Daniel 9 as we get there. Okay, so this is what we've learned about the beast and false prophet. His dominion will be taken away, annihilated and destroyed forever. He has a lot going on here. I mean, he's got to be pretty powerful to make alterations in times and law, or to intend at least to make alterations, and to war against the saints. And to, in this case, it says he will wear down the saints of the highest one. Okay, remember always, Daniel is written to Daniel's people. So this is talking about Daniel's people. Okay, so now we're going to look at Daniel chapter 9. Daniel is fasting, and he's given this information, this insight with understanding as it's talking about. So if we're only going to look at the last 4 verses, 24 through 27. In these 4 verses, what is laid out for Daniel?
New covenant.
Well, there's a certain number,
62.
70 total, 70 weeks, right? And in those 70 weeks, let's be reminded, again, talking to Daniel's people, Daniel and Daniel's people, it says 70 weeks have been decreed for your people. It says, and your holy city, to finish transgression, make an end of sin, make atonement for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up vision and prophecy, and anoint the most holy place. It's a lot of stuff. And while some parts of this may have been sort of fulfilled, it has not completely been fulfilled yet, right? So it's a total of 70 weeks. And we remember the word weeks means sevens. Sevens. Okay, so weeks means sevens. So this is 70 sevens, 70 periods, 77 periods of time. It's hard to get this said. So that's 490. And through history, we have come to understand that this is not days, it's not hours, it's not days, it's not weeks, 7-day weeks, it's not months, it's what? Years. So this is 490 years. Okay. Then we get to what you were talking about the 62. In verse 25, it says, if you're going to start the time, it says, you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. So that is 69 of the 70 weeks. Okay? So 7 weeks and 62 weeks. That started with a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Now there were other decrees. There was a decree to build the wall. There was a decree to build the temple, and the wall might have included the city. But it's not the decree to rebuild the temple, it's the decree to rebuild and restore the city of Jerusalem. All the way up to Messiah the Prince is 69. So that would be 69 times 7, or 483 years. The easiest way to do that is subtract 1/7 from 490. Can't do 69 by 7 times 7 in my head that quickly. So it's 483 of the 490 years up to Messiah the Prince. Now, has that happened? Yes.
Yes.
There has been Messiah the Prince. We learned when we studied Daniel that the day that 483 years ended was the day that Jesus rode in on the donkey that we celebrate as Palm Sunday, where they laid the palm branches down. That was about the only time that collectively a group acknowledged him as Prince or King, right? As he came in. Now that was Sunday. What happened later in that week? He was crucified. Essentially the same group of people that said, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, a few days later said, crucify him, we want Barabbas. Crucify Jesus. That's how fast mobs turn. Now, I'm just going to step over just a little bit. That's why we're not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. Because a democracy, if we go with democracy rules, we can go from Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, to 4 days later, crucify him, crucify him. That's how a group of people can be turned if we go with mob rule. That's what a democracy is. We have a democratic form of government, but we are a constitutional republic. That is so critical. If we become a democracy, well, we really kind of are. We're in trouble, big trouble. Okay, so. And we are. Yes, we are. And we're sitting in some very perilous times. So, going back to Messiah the Prince, that was the end of that 483 years. That's 7 plus 62 of the 70 weeks. How many does that leave? 7 years, it leaves 1 week. Okay, so there's 1 week that's not part of that yet. And it's part of the whole, okay? But there's that 7 and 62. So, and it's important to remember the 7 and 62 because eventually it talks about after the 62. Well, it's talking about after this 62. So it's the total of the 69. But it says, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. Now, what would that be referring to? Has that happened? The crucifixion. He was cut off and have nothing. Okay, and then it says, the people of the prince who is to come. Got to separate those two out. It's talking about the people that are associated with a prince who is to come. Okay? If that helps you, all that hand waving, will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So what people destroyed the city and the sanctuary? Romans, because that's who ruled at the time. So the people that destroyed after the 62, after the 7 plus 62, the people that destroyed the city and the sanctuary, when did they do that? 70 AD. This is after Messiah was cut off. They destroyed the city and the sanctuary in 70 AD. That's the people, the Romans, were in charge at that time. Specifically, General Titus is the one that came in of the Roman army and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Okay? So remember, people. The people of that verse are Roman. But there also is a prince who is to come. If that's a prince who hasn't come yet even to us, what people group is he coming from? Roman. Got to remember that, okay? Then in verse 27, it says he. It's referring to this prince who is to come. Okay? He will do what?
Make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week.
So stop the sacrifices.
Okay, first he makes a firm covenant for 1 week. What week is that?
7 years.
This week
Last
that has
7
yet to happen, right? It's that week. That's the week. It's a 7-year period, right? So there's going to be a 7-year covenant that he's going to make with the many. Who would the many be? Jews. Right. He will make this covenant with Daniel's people, with the many for 1 week. And in the middle of the week, so how long is that? 3.5 years. So if you have a 7-year period, in the middle of that, you're going to have 3.5. You have 3.5 left. So in the middle of the week, what's he going to do?
Stop the sacrifice and grain offerings.
He sits in the temple.
I'm sorry? He what?
Sits in the temple. and-
Doesn't say that here, but we get that from where, Sandy? You saw it this week. We get that from Thessalonians. Is it 2 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians 2? First or 2 Thessalonians, sorry.
Second.
Second, yes. It's hard for me to remember. 2 Thessalonians 2. You're reminded of the one that's going to walk into the temple. We'll get to that, but that's great. He stopped sacrifices and grain offerings. Does that sound like this? Making alterations to times and law?
Yeah.
Okay, so he's going to stop. So that also, let's hit the most literal. If he stops something, what does that mean is happening? It means the sacrifices and grain offerings are happening. I would assume, but not be sure, that it started at least when they started this covenant. It might start sooner, I don't know. And it might start after, but at the middle of the week, he stops sacrifices and grain offerings. So he's made this firm covenant for the 7 years or for 1 week, and he stops it. And then it says, on the wing of abomination will come one who makes desolate. Okay? So, one who makes desolate. But what does it say about the one who makes desolate?
There's going to be complete destruction,
Okay,
which is decreed.
okay. So there's going to be a complete destruction. Not by him, on him. Right. Okay. And sometimes that's hard to see, but just stop and look at it. All right. So this one who makes desolate is the one that stops the sacrifices and grain offerings. Okay? If he's the one that stops the sacrifices and grain offerings, it's the he who is the prince who is to come. If he's the prince who is to come from what people? Rome. Okay. Few verses packed with information. Really? Packed with information. Okay. But there's just a little nuance in there that sometimes gets lost. Daniel is told that Messiah will be cut off and the city and the sanctuary will be destroyed. Daniel is sitting in a time when there had been, he saw it, probably went to it, a temple. That temple's destroyed. Daniel is told that at the end of this 69 of his 70 weeks, the sanctuary will be destroyed. There's going to be another sanctuary. Daniel is told that, subtly almost, but it's going to be destroyed, right? But then there's a prince who is to come who's going to stop sacrifices and grain offerings in another temple. He doesn't say, guess what, there's 2 temples I'm talking about here. But because we know, Daniel also tells us, they're going to destroy the next temple that Daniel doesn't see. Daniel's told it's going to happen. It's not in Daniel's time in Babylon. That one's already destroyed. There's going to be another temple. It's going to be destroyed. And then there's going to be another temple where sacrifices and grain offerings. It's all right there. And that's what's interesting about the Old Testament that we sometimes fail to understand, is if you were using the Old Testament and talking to a Jewish person, you can tell them of a temple that is coming because you can take them to Daniel. That's why Kay also talks about this as the blueprint of all prophecy, because it covers all time. Not every detail, but they're told about 4 kingdoms. Daniel didn't see these, but we in history, and the Jewish people can see in history, all 4 of them. But he also talks about those 10 toes, the 10 kings in the 10 toes of the statue. There's more to come. And it's going to come in this prince who is to come from the people, which were the 4th kingdom, Rome. Okay. Turn the page on chapter 11 of Daniel and 12. This is a very difficult chapter. If you remember when we went through it in our study of Daniel, it is not an easy chapter. Remember that all of the visions from, I think it's 10, 11, and 12 are one whole time frame, one whole vision. It just continues and continues and more narrative, right? But the whole first part of chapter 11, all the way up through verse 35, talk about things that are future to Daniel, but are past to us. There is a transition between verse 35 and 36. Now, this is one of those things where, I hate to say trust, but you can disagree on that. You can disagree on it. There's reason that we believe this, and I think I can point out a couple of things and show you. Because it's really hard to go from 35 to 36, and it doesn't stop and say, now I'm going to be talking about a totally different time. It doesn't say that. And that's part of, sometimes with prophecy, there can be a near fulfillment of something, or a partial near fulfillment of something, and then a far complete fulfillment, but the far complete fulfillment is the total and the real. Okay? But the near fulfillment can give us an idea of what's going to happen. Okay? So at the end of that first part, when you're getting towards the end, getting close to verse 35, you see in verse 31 something that's described. Now this is describing this king that comes up, and I've got all these notes in my margins, but this is talking at this point about a historical figure that, depending on how you pronounce it, is either Antiochus or Antiochus. Antiochus Epiphanes, a true person that happened in history and time, and he is the one in 165 BC that does what's talked about in verse 31. What's happening in verse 31?
Abomination of desolation.
Abomination of desolation, okay? And what does he do? It says the forces from him will arise and desecrate the sanctuary fortress, that would be the temple fortress, and do away with what? Regular sacrifice, and will set up the abomination of desolation. Okay? Very similar to what we're hearing here. Very similar to what we think this probably means, right? Okay. But there's a difference. So just hang on for a second, because what happened in that time is he slaughtered a pig on the altar, which would have been horrible, because specifically a pig, that would have been horrible. It was never to be a pig. It was to be a lamb or an ox or a goat, but never a pig. They were forbidden to eat pigs because they were considered dirty, considered unclean. Not dirty, but unclean. But he slaughtered a pig. That's part of the abomination. But he also did something else. He set up inside the Holy of Holies a statue of Zeus. Why Zeus? He was the god that he would have thought was the premier god, right? So he is basically taking over the temple for worship for Zeus and slaughtering that pig. Now the pig slaughtering could have been his act of worship. I honestly don't know, but it certainly flew in the face of the Jewish people, and he absolutely despised the Jewish people. And if you go back through those first verses, you see a lot of comings and goings through Israel. That was he would come up from Egypt and go and fight, and then he'd come back down and go back home. And so it was back and forth, and he absolutely hated the Jewish people. So one time when he had lost and he was angry and wanted to take it out on somebody, he goes in and takes it out on the Jewish people by destroying their temple, or no, he didn't destroy their temple in the sense of tearing it down. Abomination of desolation. He desecrated, he did this abomination of desolation. And it included the pig, and it included the statue of Zeus, okay? Now that's significant to realize he set up Zeus. He didn't set up himself, okay? And that's significant because what did we already talk about that we know is going to happen in that Second Thessalonians tells us about?
He just declared himself as God.
Man of lawlessness is going to declare himself to be God. And we've seen with the beast has everyone worship himself. And Satan indirectly, but himself. So that means he is declaring himself to be God. Not Zeus, but himself. Okay? So when you have all those events of what Antiochus Epiphanes, others, but then eventually Antiochus Epiphanes does, he does this abomination of desolation. So hang on to that in your brain as this is an event that Daniel describes future to Daniel, past to us. And I want you to hang on to that. Okay, remember it happens in 165 BC. Okay, so, and we're not even going to write that because those are not the verses that we want to look at. But we have a picture of what an abomination of desolation would be because it's happened, not to Daniel, but Daniel described it, and then it has happened before our time. It has happened to the Jewish people. And by the way, it's in the intertestament period that because this happened, that happened in what we mean by intertestament period is God stopped talking in Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, until he started talking to John the Baptist's dad in the book of Matthew, the Gospels. And that period in between the Old Testament and the New Testament is what we call the intertestament, the between the testaments period of time, which is about 400 years. This happens during that time. BC, Jesus is AD, so it's before Jesus' time that this happens. And as a result of this, we have what we are even aware of that we don't practice or we don't observe, but it's the Festival of Lights, or called Hanukkah. Because there was a group of people called the Maccabees that for a short period of time in war took over Jerusalem again, wrested it back, and in doing so they also cleansed the temple because of this, because of what Daniel's describing here, because the temple had been desecrated. They cleansed the temple because of that, and we have Hanukkah. Well, they celebrate Hanukkah. We know about it. It's not a problem if we want to celebrate that. That would be a good thing to celebrate, even as Christians, is that they cleanse the temple. Not that they returned a sacrificial system, but they cleanse the temple. Then in verse 36 and on, again, it's a hard to see transition, but understand that it says in verse 36, it identifies a personage, and what is that? King. What does it say about him?
Will do as he pleases.
Will do
himself above all other gods.
Right. Okay, so again, here's a distinction between what we know about Antiochus Epiphanes. He did exalt himself. The Romans tended to call themselves gods and stuff, but they worshipped a lot of gods. He didn't say he was the one and only God. But this king, starting in verse 36, he will do as he pleases, and what were you just saying that he does, Judy?
He blasphemes God.
Right.
And exalts and magnifies
Well, that was what I was saying.
Exalts, yes. So he exalts, and it says, and magnifies himself above
Every god.
every God. This is one way we can see the distinction. And again, sometimes it's subtle, but it's there. He exalts himself above every god. He also speaks the monstrous things against gods. We could call against the God of gods, or sorry, our God. And that, so that reminds us of who?
Yes.
Yes. That reminds us of the Beast of 13. It reminds us of the uttering boasts of the horn, even though that's not quite as clear. And then we'll get to the 2 Thessalonians, even though we keep talking about it, but we will get there and it'll all tie in. So he exalts himself above every god. He has no regard for the gods of his fathers. And it's plural, little g, but it's plural gods of his fathers. Who would his fathers have been? What? Romans. And the Romans had tons of gods. Their own, other people's, they just kind of absorbed everybody's. And then, I'm sorry, in verse 36 at the end it says, he will prosper until what? Indignation is finished and what is decreed will be done. So there is an end to it. It's indicating there will be an end. But he will prosper until then, okay? He will not show regard for the gods of his fathers or for what?
Women.
The desire of women. Okay, there's a detail that we've not seen before. Nor will he show regard for any god, for he will magnify himself above them all. So it's just stating again, he exalts and magnifies himself above every god. Instead, he will honor what?
A god of fortresses.
Okay, he'll honor a god of fortresses. And this is not a God that any of his fathers knew about, right? And it's him his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, and costly stones and treasures. And he will take action against the strongest of fortresses. Now remember, he's honoring a god of fortresses, and he will take over or go after some of the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god, foreign to his fathers, not known before. And he will give great honor to who?
Those acknowledge.
Yes. How does he give him great honor? In what way does he do it?
To be able to rule over many.
Now, if he's saying that he is God and exalting himself over all gods out there, even though he gives honor to this one God, the God of fortresses, it doesn't say he cares anything about that God or that God's equal to him. It just says he gives honor to that God, and then he goes after fortresses. Those who are acknowledging him, how are they acknowledging him? Yes, they're acknowledging him as this thing that he says he is. He's above all gods. That would be one way. And how does he reward them? He gives them rule over many, right?
And land.
And parcels out land for a price. Okay? So that also indicates, what does he have to give? Land. And rule. And obviously costly stones and all this stuff. He's prospering. It had said he'll prosper for a time. And then it says, and at the end time, the king of the south will collide with him, the king of the north. Now, referring back to the previous part of the chapter, the king of the north would have been north of Israel. Remember, all direction is relative to Israel. So north of Israel would have been, at the time that Daniel was writing this, or at the time of the Antiochus Epiphanes, would have been like Syria. Okay? The king of the south would have been Egypt. Okay, remember how Antiochus Epiphanes would come up from Egypt through Israel to go against the king of the north, and the king of the, he would come back through, constantly back and forth through Israel. That was the stomping grounds. And here it's talking about, probably referring to those same geographic areas, which would have been Syria at that time, Egypt at that time as far as north and south is concerned. Then it specifically talks about it says, and he will enter the beautiful land. He's going to tread back and forth through there, it looks like, kind of like Antiochus Epiphanes did, and many countries will fall. And these will be rescued out of his hand. Who?
Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon.
Edom, Moab, and foremost of the sons of Ammon. Just a historic reference. Edom was Jacob's brother, Esau. Edom is the country that Esau established. Esau was Jacob's brother. What's another name for Jacob? Israel, right? They're the sons of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham, just to give you a genealogy, okay? The sons, the Moab and the sons of Ammon, who are they? Lot's children by his daughters. One of them had Moab, and the other one had the sons of Ammon, or began the sons of Ammon. So these are relatives, close relatives to what we would call the Israelites. Okay, and they're people groups that have constantly come against Israel at times or not helped them during the wandering. They're in and out of Israel's history and tied to them. For whatever reason, it says those three countries or those people groups will be rescued out of the hand of this king. But what does that also tell you? They're coming against him or he's going against them. Whatever interaction, okay? He will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. So now we have Egypt mentioned specifically. And then it's talking about the Libyans and the Ethiopians. Ethiopians will follow at his heels. Geographically, the Libyans would have been to the west of Egypt, and the Ethiopians would have been the south of Egypt. All of that coming from the south of Israel to that directional sense. Then it says, rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. So this is just a very warring, nasty, overcoming period of time, right? And he prospers, remember, for a time he prospers. But in verse 45, what does it say?
Pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain.
Okay, so if he's pitching his tents of his royal pavilion, he's setting up camp of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. Where is that? The beautiful holy mountain, yes, would be Jerusalem. The seas would have been Mediterranean, and he sets up his camp in between them. Okay? And that's what?
No, we're talking.
Okay.
Look at the map.
It looks like there's a little tent on the map.
Oh, there's a little tent, okay. Or you're looking at the map she gave you in your lesson. Okay. So when she asked you in your lesson to draw a picture of all that stuff, I just like drew arrows in different colors, and it will make no sense to hardly anybody. But you see what land is right in the middle of it all. Yeah, Israel's right in the middle of it all. At the end of this chapter, what does it say happens to him? Yeah.
He will come to an end.
Okay, so he pitches his tent in, I'm just going to say, the beautiful land. And his end comes.
No one will help him. Amazing.
In that entry, no one will help him. And then in chapter 12, when you transition into that, after we just finished 11, is there a mention of this king? Not directly. No, there's no more mention of him, but remember, we're talking about this time. Okay, so in verse 1, when it says, at that time, what time are we talking about? When all of this is going on, or at least right here at the end, but certainly when all of this is going on, what are Daniel's people told? What is Daniel told and his people are told through him? Michael, right? Who's Michael?
Archangel.
He will arise, right? And it says of Michael, who stands guard over the sons of your people. This is, sometimes we call Michael the archangel, we call him the guardian angel of Israel, of Daniel's people, right? It says because it says right now, he stands guard over the sons of your people, but he will arise during this time. So that just kind of indicates there's more action taking place on his part. And there will be a time of distress, such as never happened before. This isn't the best of news. It is good news, though. Such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time, the time that we're talking about. And at that time, your people, everyone who's found written in the book, will be rescued, right? But there is that distinction. Your people, not every Jew, not every one of God's chosen people, but those whose names are found written in the book will be rescued. Okay, we've studied other passages before. Does that ring any bells for you?
Will be a remnant who will.
There'll be a remnant. Remember, 2/3 in Zechariah, we're told 2/3 will be cut off. 1/3 is taken through the fire and refined, and that third will be saved. Romans tells us, therefore, all Israel will be saved. That's what it's talking about here. Everyone whose name is found written in the book will be rescued at this point that we're talking about. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. That should remind you of Revelation chapter 20. Those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But as for you, Daniel, conceal and seal up until the end of time. And then you drop down and you see that he talks about in verse 7, it will be for how long? Time, times, and half a time. As soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. That doesn't sound good, does it? The end part does. Okay, so for time, times, I ran out of space, and half a time.
It's similar to Revelation 6.
In what respect?
With they called out how long, and he said until the rest of the saints should be.
Right, until your number is completed. Those are the souls under the altar, exactly. So, and that's in the 5th seal. But they, so we have, it's a similar thought process, but we have this time frame of time, times, and half a time, that this time of distress is talked about. At the end of that time of distress, all those written in the book will be rescued, but it's going to last for time, and it's going to take the shattering of the power of the holy people for this to happen. It's going to be a very, very difficult and bad time. It says a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. So, again, I did not live during the time of Hitler, but certainly lived not long after and have known about it all my life that I can remember. That was a horrible, horrible time, right? Directed, not just, but directed very specifically against what people? Jews. This is worse. It's talking about a time that's worse than that. That's hard news. It's hard to think about having to go through. And they're not the only ones going to be impacted, but they will be impacted. And then it says, in verse 10, many will be purged, purified, and refined. Again, that reminds me of Zechariah 13, where it's talking about the 2/3 that will be cut off and the 1/3 that will be purified and refined. But the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand. Those who have insight will understand. So there's going to be a big dichotomy between the wicked and those who have insight. From the time of the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Sorry about going sideways here. And that's the abomination of desolation. So now we've got a tie-in from the abomination of desolation and the regular sacrifice being abolished to the end is 1,290 days. Prior to this, we've been hearing 1,260 days, so this is an additional 30 days. And then it says, so let's be more confusing, how blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days, right? Okay. So if you think back to your Revelation 20, where Jesus has come in 19, the beast and the false prophet, the war has happened, the beast and false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. Then Satan is bound for 1,000 years, but then it also says thrones are set up and judgment happens. There's going to be some things that have to happen as that kingdom is brought in. I believe some of that is this 30 days and then that additional 45 days beyond the 1,290 into the 1,335. Might be, possibly, some of that. Okay, so that's Daniel 12, and we're going to go on to Matthew 24. And Mark 13 is very similar. Very, very similar. Hardly any differences between them, although I hope you did look at both in detail and write out your details. This is where Jesus is speaking and he's answering the questions. He's answering the questions his disciples asked after Jesus leaves the temple for the last time of his earthly ministry. He's gone, he's leaving the temple, and he's leaving it desolate. He's leaving. The Spirit of God walks out. God himself walks out. And they completely missed the time of their visitation. They didn't get it, at least corporately. Several did. Okay, so they're asked, when will these things happen? Because he's just told them the stones won't be left upon another. He goes through, and we've gone through this in detail in part 3, but he tells them about the birth pangs, the beginning of the birth pangs. There are wars and rumors of wars, nations against nations. There's many that will come and say, I am the Christ. There's many false prophets. There's many that will deceive. And there's even some that will turn people over to the courts, turn people in, right? Okay, so if you're sitting there as one of Jesus' disciples, what happens next in their lives after Jesus' ascension? That kind of thing. You know, Paul goes and persecutes them until Paul's conversion, and people are killed as a result. They're scattered because God wanted them to go into the world, but they're scattered by the circumstances of this persecution. This happens to them, and that's beginnings of birth pangs. But he says it's not the end yet. Are we in the birth pangs? Yeah, it's not the end yet. There's several things, but there's something he said has to happen till right before the end.
Abomination of desolation.
Right, there's going to have to be an abomination of desolation. But there's also, right before that, he says the gospel has to be preached everywhere. But then we have this set of events. So we've got Matthew, and I'll say others, because we're going to have to write it all in here. We've got the abomination of desolation. And there's a lot, there's a flee. Judea is to flee into the wilderness. We know and believe that's tied into the woman of Revelation 12 fleeing to the place God has prepared for her. So this is the last part. This abomination of desolation happens at that midpoint. Going back to here, when he, the prince who is to come, stops the sacrifices and grain offerings. Okay? So at that point, from that point forward, we have the abomination of desolation, and it tells the stuff that's happening, but he calls that time what? The Great Tribulation. Okay. The time of distress that's talked about in Daniel 12. Time of distress. It's a bad time. Shattering of the power of the holy people. It's a really bad time. And then at the end of it says immediately following the days of the tribulation, what happens? Right. So we have what happens, we've got the sun, moon, and stars affected and the powers of heaven shaken. And then we have the event of what? The Son of Man comes. Yes, there's more details, like there's the sign, and then the Son of Man comes on the clouds with power and great glory. What does he send forth?
Angels.
He sends forth his angels to do what?
Gather together the elect from the four winds.
Okay. And then there's, following this, there's descriptions of what the days are like. The days of Noah, a thief, not a thief, it doesn't say that here, sorry. You have the days of Noah, like the flood, nobody knew. There's a woman at the mill grinding, 2 men in the field, one's taken, one's left. But it specifically says, who knows when this is going to happen? Father alone knows. The Father knows. No one else does. So in light of not knowing when, how are we to live? Like it could be any minute, like it's today. Like we are to live in light of the imminency of these events happening. And remember, when he gives the analogy of Noah, for all of those, like I think it's 120 years that Noah is building that ark, he's preaching righteousness, telling them what God has told him is going to happen. How many believed him?
His sons, 6 men and their wives.
His sons, their wives, and his wife. So 7 plus Noah, 8. And there were millions of people on the earth at the time. Don't think there was just a couple or dozens. Millions of people were on the earth at the time. They believed when did they believe? When the rain came and the waters came up and they were drowning. Did that save them? No. Similarly, when these events happen, it's too late. If you haven't believed, it's too late at that point. But those who will see him will look on him and know. Remember, because only those who are written in the book will be rescued. Zechariah says the third that has been refined that will remain. All Israel will be saved because God's going to call out the ones that aren't in the process. It's a horrible, horrible time for this time of distress. Okay, only the Father knows the time. That's said in both Matthew and Mark. The Son doesn't know. There's a wonderful picture of that in the Jewish wedding ceremony, that there's a moment when the father and son are preparing the house for the bride, and preparing, and you know the son is looking, going, okay, all you have to do is hammer that last nail, or, screw in that last light bulb. Of course, that's today's analogy. He knows they're almost ready. He knows it's almost there, but still, it's the Father that says, it's time. And when the Father says, it's time, what chapter of Revelation are we talking about? 19, when Jesus returns with his bride. With his bride. We're with him at that point. The marriage has happened, and we're with him. It's time. Okay, so that's Matthew and Mark, but in 2 Thessalonians, let's not miss this. 2 Thessalonians, that we've referred to so many times, because we can't not. We know it, so we got to put it in there. But 2 Thessalonians tells us there is a person that's called what?
Man of lawlessness.
Yes, there's I'm going to call him the M-O-L, the man of lawlessness. Man of lawlessness. He's also called what?
Son of destruction.
Right. He's the son of destruction. And what does he do?
He exalts himself above every other god.
Okay. He opposes and exalts himself above every so-called god or object of worship so that he takes his seat. Where does he take his seats?
Temple.
And what else does he do?
Displays himself as God.
He displays himself as God. It's not enough just to walk in. There's more. Many have walked in over the years, and this is the last temple that hasn't happened yet. But over time in the temple, many have walked in. Some correctly as the priest when he should. Others, there was a king that walked in and got leprosy as a result. There's I forgot which king was that. But then there's Antiochus Epiphanes, who set up Zeus, or had him set up, in the temple. But now we have one who takes his seat in the temple and declares himself as God. This is the one who makes desolate. This is the abomination of desolation that's coming. Now remember, I told you to hold on to 165 BC, abomination of desolation by Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Jesus came in the time frame that we believe is somewhere between 1 and 33 AD, after 165 BC, right? Okay, just making sure we're getting our timeline right. I probably should turn it this way. 165 BC and then 1 through 33-ish AD. In that time, around 33 AD, Jesus is talking about the abomination of desolation that's going to happen. Is he talking about 165 BC? No. He's talking about another one that's going to happen. That's what he's talking about in Matthew 24 and Mark 13, same thing. He's talking about an abomination of desolation that's going to happen, okay, after Jesus is talking about it, okay? There's many that think in the Luke passage, when it's talking about when your city is surrounded by armies, let the reader beware, let those in Judea flee to the mountain. We know that to be 70 AD, when General Titus came in and destroyed the temple, destroyed the city and destroyed the temple. Did he, in doing so, do any of this? No. He did not declare himself as being God. He hated the Jews, but he did not declare himself. He did not desolate the temple. He destroyed it. Just like Jesus had said, not one stone will be left on another. So 70 AD did not fulfill this that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24. But it gave us a picture, gave us a little bit of an idea, but not a full fulfillment. When God gives a prophecy, how accurate is he? 100%. So if we have a partial fulfillment, we don't have the full fulfillment until we have the full fulfillment. That's the one that he's ultimately talking about. Sometimes it gives us a picture. So when this happens, when Paul is writing about this in 2 Thessalonians, he's still writing about something that's going to happen that hasn't happened yet and did not happen in 70 AD. This is the abomination of desolation that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24 that Jesus said Daniel talked about, right? So Daniel talked about two different abomination of desolation. The one he talked about in Daniel 11, verse 34, I think it was, happened with Antiochus Epiphanes. The one he talks about in Daniel 12, he's talking about is this last one. So Daniel talks about two different abomination of desolation. So when Jesus says the one Daniel's talking about, he's not talking about the one that had already happened in by Jesus' time that Jesus would know about. But then the people listening would understand what he's talking about when he's talking about an abomination of desolation. Because they, in their history, know about Antiochus Epiphanes when Jesus is talking to them. So he's referring to something that's going to happen that looks back and harkens to something that has already happened, that they have an idea about. But it's different. The abomination of desolation in Daniel 11:30, whatever it was, 33 or 34, did not completely do what 2 Thessalonians, what Paul's telling us the man of lawlessness is going to do. Walk in and declare himself to be God. There's more in this chapter about he's being restrained, and there has to be an apostasy first. Falling away is what an apostasy means. You have to come to something to fall away from it. So you have to come to a belief system or religious practices. What belief system or religious practices are we probably referring to here? The sacrifices and worship of the temple. Most of the time when you hear this quoted, they'll tell you they're talking about the church's apostasy. We're not probably talking about the church's apostasy, although that's happening and has happened. And you can see it in the letters of the churches that John writes about in Revelation, right? And then when you get to Revelation chapter 17, she wanted you to look at that again. We looked at it some last week to try to help understand, because it is a very difficult chapter as well. But we're talking about the harlot riding on the scarlet beast. The scarlet beast has 7 heads or horns? 7 heads, 10. 7 heads, 10 horns. The 7 heads are 7 mountains and 7 kings, right? And then there's the 10, what did we just say, horns, that are also 10 kings? Okay. So when we're talking about the beast in chapter 17 of Revelation, he is never called one of the 10, is he? There's 10 kings, he's not one of those 10. But of the 7, which one is it, heads or 7 heads, he is one of the 7 heads, but he's also an 8. How does that happen? Because he is one of them, he dies, and he comes back to life, and therefore is that 8th one. Okay? Kay proposes the 5 which have already fallen, and the 1 which is of the 7, and there's 1 that is to come. I'm sorry, there's 1 to come. I'm sorry, let me make sure I get it right. It says 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. Okay, so that's the 7. 5 have fallen. She proposes that's 5 kingdoms that ruled over Israel before now. Before when John is writing, okay? The one that is would be what kingdom when John is writing? Rome, okay? And then it says there's one that is to come. That's what we're saying is possibly this revived Roman Empire, okay? So there were, Egypt always had problems, Israel always had problems with Egypt. And then Assyria took the northern kingdom into captivity, and then you have Babylon, the Medo-Persian, the Greek, and Roman. That's number 6. That's number 6, sorry. And then we have possibly the revived Roman Empire. That's just a possibility. We don't die on those hills, remember that. But that's a possibility of what it's saying, the 5 that have fallen, etc. And then you have those 10 kings. Those 10 kings are related to the 10 toes of Daniel chapter 2, the 10 horns of Daniel chapter 7, the 10 horns here, the kings that will have their armies. They're given not a kingdom, but they're given authority as kings. And what is their whole purpose? What does it say here? Their whole to get their power and give it immediately to the beast, right? And then they turn on who? They turn first on the harlot, and then later they come against Jesus when he returns in chapter 19. They're gathered by those demons, frog things. Lot of information. So you begin maybe to kind of take apart and understand some of the things that maybe you've been told in the past correctly about the beast or the Antichrist to come. That he's going to have what kind of rule? He's going to, number 1, have a kingdom, right? How broad is his power and authority? Over the whole world. There's going to be worship of him. So what does that indicate? There's a religion involved, right? So you a lot of times will hear one world religion, one world government, one world finance or bank or whatever you want to call that. Do you see now why that is being said? Does it say that directly in Scripture? Not exactly. But when you put all the parts together and you see what kind of process we're going through.
Well, we are in that process.
We're headed there.
Preparing the way.
We're at least in those birth pains, right? The way is being prepared, right? And when other places where we see that when they're coming in this time of distress, when the world is coming against Israel, no one stands with her. So where does that put the United States? Not standing with her. Maybe being one that comes against her. Or maybe not being.
Direction now,
Maybe
too.
not being.
Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe not being in existence, or certainly being defunct. Possibly. That's why you hear some of the things that you hear being said. Maybe they're taking a leap in logic, or they're jumping over here and they don't prepare you all the way up to it. But you know this stuff, and you can start, not that you should just readily agree with everybody, but you start going, that's why they talk about a one world government. That's why they talk about, now this is still future to us. But the way it's being prepared, I agree with you on that. The way it's being prepared. What do we do as a result? How do we live? That's the application. How do we live right this moment? How do we walk out this door? What should we be doing? Preparing ourselves and telling others. Right. I've said this so many times. I don't want anybody to have to go through this. They will. There will be people.
And acting as if this is the last day.
Yes. Always, ever being ready as if it could be right now. It could be right now. It could be right now. And I say that with a smile. Because to be honest with you, I want it right now. I want out of here. But guess what? We're not guaranteed that. Because who knows the day and the hour? Only the Father knows. And that is of the return of Christ to the earth. So we're ahead of that. That we're going to not be here. Do you know we have a whole lesson on that? It's like one of the last few lessons. So next week we start in on, I believe, Babylon for 2 weeks to really fully understand Babylon. And I hope this gave you a much better understanding of the beast, because Revelation told us a lot. But other parts of Scripture tell us that much more. And don't forget last week where John called him the Antichrist and said there's a spirit of Antichrist in the world today. Why is it important to understand both the deity and humanity of Christ? Because otherwise, we're believing like the Antichrist believes. And that is something we need to stay so strongly to and never depart from, not just in our own lives, but in our practices and the people in our statements. So we'll pray and we'll have our lesson, our meal and our lesson from Kay. Gracious and kind